Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Monday, May 2nd, and here is some of what we're talking about tonight. Russian soldiers have expanded their control of Mariupol as people desperate to leave are finally getting out. What becomes of the ones who cannot escape? Tomorrow is primary election day in Ohio and Indiana. We'll preview the major races from Capitol Hill to the governor's mansion. Then, today marks 50 years since a turning point in mental health treatment. Who was Dr. Anonymous, and why is there a push to commemorate his courageous acts? Plus, it's one of the biggest nights in fashion, the Met Gala. We will take you to the red carpet at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. We've been waiting to see when people in eastern Ukraine might evacuate from Russian bombings. Well, now it looks like a brief ceasefire allowed a few people to escape from Mariupol. Officials there say about 1,000 people had taken shelter at a steel plant there. President Volodymyr Zelensky says that about 100 people have now been evacuated. It's unclear how many more will be able to escape. Here is how some of the evacuees described life inside the steel plant and what they saw when they got out.
40 с лишним человек, 6 консерв, с них варилось 2 ведра супа и все. Это на целый... Нету, конечно, нету. Где он взялся? Он не может быть целым, потому что там бомбежки каждый день были. Сколько мы сидели в бункере, сколько их бомбили.
Mariupol had nearly 500,000 people before the war. Today, about 100,000 are left, and the city is basically in ruins. While Russia holds a strong presence in eastern Ukraine, more U.S. officials are visiting further west. Today, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was in Poland meeting its President Andrzej Duda. The goal was to strengthen ties with this NATO ally. Over the weekend, Speaker Pelosi made a surprise trip to Kyiv. She led a delegation of Democratic lawmakers to meet with President Zelensky. Nancy Pelosi is the highest-ranking U.S. official to visit Ukraine during the war, at least in terms of the line of succession to the president she is. And she has vowed to back Ukraine, in her words, until victory is won. NBC's Cal Perry starts us off tonight from Kyiv. And Cal, I wonder what more we know about the people who are left at that steel plant and the efforts to try and get them out.
So we know it's a few hundred, if not a few thousand. Those are our best guesses really on numbers, that coming from Ukrainian officials who are on that site. About 600, we understand, civilians still wounded in that site, about 600 military personnel wounded. We also know the fighting is fierce. The fighting is fierce on a block-to-block sort of scale in and around this steel plant. And we also now know that there are some pretty fortified bunkers under there. We know that because of the video that was released over the weekend where you actually see people sort of climbing out, and there's that video right there, of basically what is small holes poking out of the rubble. This is sort of how it had been described to us. It is good now to sort of be able to more independently verify it through this video. Whether or not there is a further rescue remains to be seen. I think that's very unlikely. We heard the Ukrainian government talking about perhaps rescue attempts, perhaps resupplying some of these people. But with the fighting that is taking place in the area, it seems now clear that the only way that people are going to get out of there is with the assistance of the International Red Cross and the United Nations, both of which Joshua have said it is their priority to implement some kind of ceasefire and try to get more civilians out of that steel plant.
Speaking of assistance, we mentioned that Speaker Pelosi was in Kyiv over the weekend. Here's a bit more of what she said during her trip.
We believe that we are visiting you to say thank you for your fight for freedom, that we are on a frontier of freedom, and that your fight is a fight for everyone. And so our commitment is to be there for you until the fight is done.
Cal, do we have a sense of what she meant by that, to be there for you until the fight is done? What does being there for Ukraine mean?
I don't think it's at all clear. I think the Ukrainian president would like it to be military assistance until Russia is defeated, but nobody really knows what defeat looks like. I also think it's not lost on Ukrainian officials, particularly the president of Ukraine, who had a phone call with the previous administration, President Donald Trump, was asking for weapons of which he would then use to fight the Russians, and got nothing. Not only that, was caught up in an international incident. So I think the president of Ukraine is pretty akin to the fact that things can change quickly in Washington. It's one of the reasons that he has said in the past, before foreign leaders come to visit him here, he wants things other than just presents, other than just cakes. He wants real promises. He wants to see military aid. There has been, of course, an incredible, almost unprecedented amount of military aid from the United States here to Ukraine, $33 billion worth, and a lot of that aid and actual military hardware is already on the ground. But to your, I think, bigger question, which is the right question to ask, are people here worried that things can change? Of course they are. And as we've seen now explosions taking place on the Russian side of the border, I think there's a concern amongst people who are calling for peace here, amongst the United Nations, that is becoming a further and further possibility the more military defeats that Russia incurs, and as it continues to lash out by, for example, shooting rockets at Kyiv or threatening some kind of nuclear attack, Joshua.
With regard to the situation in Kyiv, Cal, talk about how things are there now. The police chief of the region around Kyiv has said that more than 1,200 civilians have been found dead there since Russian forces left. But how are things now?
Well, and I think this is in many ways the headline from today. You have more than 280 people still unidentified, more than 300 people still missing. It gives you an idea of how fierce the fighting was here just, a couple of weeks ago. Things are relatively safe here. I say relatively, of course, because we had cruise missiles strike here just about 72 hours ago. And those cruise missiles seem to be timed as a response to many of these high-profile visits. I say that as a way of a backdrop of saying that Speaker Pelosi was just here, and I think there is an expectation amongst government officials here that we could see a Russian response. And look, Vladimir Putin has said the more explosions that take place in Russia, the more that I will strike the Ukrainian capital. And we are continuing to see explosions take place on the Russian side of the border. So I think there's some fear here that we could see more strikes, Joshua.
And what does that mean in terms of the future prospects of, for example, the U.S. Embassy rebuilding its presence in Kyiv? One diplomatic official said they'd like to return to Kyiv by the end of the month. How feasible does that look?
Well, look, I think it's quite likely we'll see the embassy reopen. But to speak frankly about it, how functional it will be, I think, is the real question. I think there's a symbolic need to get it open here in the capital. I think that the Ukrainian president would certainly like to see that. He would like to see diplomatic missions come back here. Part of the reason for that being, you would think in normal circumstances it makes it harder for the Russians to carry out airstrikes. Now, look, Vladimir Putin has shown his willingness to carry out airstrikes even as the U.S. Secretary of Defense was here, even as the Defense Secretary was here. So how functional it is, I think, is the question. It could open and we could see sort of a shadow embassy in Lviv that would actually be going through the sort of daily normal operations of an embassy. I think that that's possible, that you'll see, again, these sort of symbolic openings that aren't very functional, Joshua.
Thank you, Cal. That's NBC's Cal Perry starting us off tonight from Kyiv. Now, as we mentioned, Russian forces are occupying Mariupol tonight. By some accounts, residents are reportedly being forced to listen to Russia's national anthem. So what might the city's future look like? Let's continue now with NBC News military analyst Colonel Jack Jacobs, also a Medal of Honor recipient. Colonel Jacobs, good to see you again. Welcome.
Good. Thank you.
What is your sense of the strategy around Mariupol? They're in charge of the Russians seem to be in charge of a large chunk of land kind of in southern Ukraine around Mariupol. I believe we have a map that can show Russian advances to the west of Mariupol as well. If you look on the map, that small body of water, there's the Sea of Azov. You see Mariupol, a port city to the north of the Sea of Azov, and all that red territory going down to Crimea is Russian-controlled territory. What is your sense of the strategy there? I'm guessing they don't necessarily need the city of Mariupol because they've leveled the city. They might just need the land.
Well, if Russian actions up until now are any indication, they don't care very much about cities at all, and they're just as happy to completely destroy them, not thinking about what they need to do if they wind up controlling it. It's a bit like a riff on the old observation. It doesn't matter it's important that I win, but it's much more important that you lose. Russia's midterm and long-term objectives here is to control the entire coast along the Black Sea, and you can see that they control that by the Sea of Azov. And if you follow the coast of the Black Sea down to the southwest, you'll see that the next obvious target is going to be, major target is going to be Odessa. We can expect exactly the same thing to happen to Odessa because the Russians don't care whether or not they level the city. All they want to do is take control of that terrain. They want to open up a land bridge so that from Crimea all the way to the west, and from there be able to attack Moldova and take control of the Transnistria region. So they're going to do whatever they can, including leveling these cities, in order to take control of that area, Joshua.
So if they want the land more than the cities, then I wonder what your sense is of why evacuations have been so tough. Would it not just behoove the Russians to tell the people who are there to give them a chance to get out before they go in and make a larger offensive, rather than just kind of holding them at bay?
Well, you're probably being much more logical than they are. I mean, there are reports that the Russians have already kidnapped between 500,000 and 1 million Ukrainians and brought them to Russia. Whether or not it makes any sense doesn't matter here. What they want to do is terrorize the population. So evacuations are extremely difficult because the Russians target train stations, airfields, train lines, main supply routes, that is roads, out of the area, so it becomes extremely difficult to do two things. First, evacuate civilians, but more important to the Russians, it becomes extremely difficult to resupply the Ukrainians, and that's what they're really after. So that's why it's so difficult to open up areas and have civilians leave, because the Russians want to control all the access to these cities. Joshua.
And if we could put that map back up for 1 second, I just want to make sure we illustrate what you're saying, Colonel Jacobs. You can see the map there. There's Mariupol over off the northern tip of the Sea of Azov. You work your way over. There's Kherson in the middle. Beyond that, Odessa. Past Odessa, that next country in green is Moldova. Behind that is Romania. So I can see what you're talking. And the large body of water at the bottom, that's the Black Sea. So, Colonel, I can kind of see what you're talking about in terms of making sort of an east-west land bridge, plus that north-south line close to the Russian border, and use all of that to kind of squeeze supplies out, or at least theoretically, that could be the Russian strategy. Let me get a question to you from one of our viewers in terms of how the Ukrainians might fight back defensively. Here is what Debbie left in our inbox.
Is there any technology out there that will reroute those missiles in electromagnetic fields, stopping them from even going up in the air?
Debbie, I appreciate your question. And Colonel, a lot of people have been asking about the kinds of technology that might be available to frustrate Russian offensives on the ground. What would you say to Debbie?
Well, it's extremely difficult to intercept these missiles, particularly the cruise missiles, while they're in the air. Once they're launched, very difficult to intercept them. The time to get them is when they're on the ground. Now, we have the capability of providing intelligence to the Ukrainians to pinpoint the locations from where they're firing artillery and rockets and land-based cruise missiles. Give that information to the Ukrainians and let them fire back. That's one of the reasons why we're giving them more artillery, basically counter-battery artillery, and lots of ammunition so they can fire back, not just at Russian formations in assembly areas from which they can launch ground attacks, which the Russians have been reluctant to do, but more importantly, to attack Russian artillery formations to prevent the Russians from supporting their ground troops. We sent them something like 144,000 rounds, artillery rounds, but at the current use, it's only about maybe a week to a week and a half's worth of ammunition. One of the things the West has to do is provide many more rounds of ammunition for Ukrainian artillery so they can fire counter battery against the kinds of things Debbie's talking about.
So here's kind of what I want to know about it. I feel like if this is the strategy, right? If Russia's strategy is to build this bridge kind of along the southern edge and the eastern edge of Ukraine, choke out supplies, prevent the port cities from being used to resupply the Ukrainian people, and then move in, this feels like it becomes a battle of attrition to the point where Russia is trying to kind of outlast the Ukrainians and outlast the West, and maybe possibly get to the point where Western countries are like, how long have we been sending you weapons and how much have we spent on artillery and ammunition, and just try to grind the Ukrainians down, especially since the kind of effort to bum rush Kyiv didn't work. So now maybe the Russians, and correct me if this sounds like a crazy strategy, they might just try to wait the Ukrainians out and then move in once an opportunity presents itself. Does that make sense?
Well, there's a cogent argument that that's exactly the case. Their original idea, and I think they're still harboring the possibility of doing that, is to move forces that are currently in the south and link them up with forces in the north and bifurcate the country, isolate the Ukrainian army in the east, and make it impossible for the Ukrainians to fight back in the east, and then figure out what they're going to do after that. Failing that, if they can't do that, waiting them out is exactly what they figure that they'll be able to do. And the impetus for doing that, the capability of doing that, rests with their artillery, cruise missiles, and other indirect fire that they fire at these main supply routes, Ukrainian locations and cities, and figure that it will be a war of attrition, and ultimately, not that we will give up supplying them, but the Ukrainians themselves will decide that they will have had enough, Joshua.
And do you see, before I got to let you go, do you see in terms of the support that the Ukrainians are getting from Western nations, that is the kind of support they need to prevent that sort of thing from happening?
Yes, finally, the West has decided that we are going to send them all the things that they need. It took us a long time to convince our allies in Western Europe that they really needed to support the Ukrainians, and they're finally doing it. But that's going to be, we're going to have to continue to prod them to do that, because as time goes on, and as you suggest, there'll be some fatigue in Germany and Italy and France and our other allies, because they won't want to continue supporting the Ukrainians. They'll just get tired. It's up to us to make sure that that doesn't happen, Joshua.
Retired Colonel Jack Jacobs, we appreciate you making time as always, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
Still to come, the midterms are underway. We will preview the big races for tomorrow's primary elections in Ohio and Indiana. Plus, did former President Trump break the law in Georgia during the 2020 election? A newly installed grand jury will help figure that out. And we are proud to announce that Now Tonight is now available as a podcast. If you don't have time to watch us live, now you've got another way to keep up to date. So scan the QR code right there on the screen to subscribe and share that link with a friend. You can also listen on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Midterm elections are nearly 6 months away, but primary season is already here. Tomorrow, voters in Ohio and Indiana will cast ballots for a few key races, from county executive to governor to members of Congress. One race in Ohio that's getting lots of attention is the Republican race for Senate. You can see some of the primary polling showing that the author of Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance, is leading the polls right now. Mr. Vance shot up in the polls after getting former President Trump's endorsement a few weeks ago, and the president has since hit the campaign trail with him. Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida says J.D. Vance's candidacy is a test of Mr. Trump's control over the Republican Party since he left office.
We don't want a circumstance where the establishment could claim that they defeated Trump. So President Trump's brand is on the line, the MAGA brand is on the line, and we couldn't be prouder that J.D. Vance is a standard bearer for our movement.
NBC's Jesse Kirsch has more on the race.
The Ohio Senate primary coming down to the wire. Voters head to the polls just hours from now in the Buckeye State to decide who will represent the GOP in the fall general election. J.D. Vance has been surging in the latest Fox News poll, but he has not been able to shake Josh Mandel, the former state treasurer, even after Vance got the coveted endorsement from former President Donald Trump. One of Trump's top surrogates, Florida Representative Matt Gaetz, said to me over the weekend that the Trump brand is on the line. So the stakes are high here in Ohio, not just for voters in this state, but across the country. And it raises the question of how much influence Donald Trump continues to have over the Republican Party. But Josh Mandel, even after missing out on the former president's endorsement, continues to style himself as a pro-Trump candidate. So even if Donald Trump's candidate of choice doesn't win this primary, it's quite possible that his ideas, his brand, his policy positions, his thumbprint can here in Ohio, setting the stage for other primaries across the country. Back to you.
Thank you, Jesse. That's NBC's Jesse Kirsch reporting from Ohio. Meanwhile, President Trump is also top of mind in Georgia for a very different reason. Authorities in Fulton County, that's the Atlanta area, continue to investigate whether he broke any laws in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Today, grand jury selection began in downtown Atlanta. NBC's Blaine Alexander has that story.
Well, let's first talk about the process of seating these grand jurors. This was actually the quickest process of the day. It took about 90 minutes, so this was over and done before we even got halfway through the day. They quickly sifted through about 200 people who were summoned today and ultimately sat 23 grand jurors and 3 alternates. So that process was relatively quick. But as for what we could see going forward, that's something that could stretch out for a while. Remember, this body has the power to convene and to meet for the next year. Now, what's important is they don't have the power to approve indictments, but they do have subpoena power. Now, that's certainly key because it means that they can compel witnesses. They can compel people to come here and testify under oath, including elected officials. Now, remember, of course, all of this circles around that now infamous phone call from former President Trump to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. So likely top of the list of people they'll want to hear from is the Secretary of State himself. Now, we can't talk about today's proceedings without talking about the other thing that's going on here in Georgia. Today is the first day of early voting ahead of the state's May 24th primary. So it's certainly remarkable that on the day that voting for 2022 officially gets underway, we're still talking about 2020, and it still is very much at the forefront. But the DA has said that when it comes to timing, she doesn't plan to have any subpoenas issued before the month of June. Why? Well, one, it takes some time to get these things going, but also, two, because she says she doesn't want to do this ahead of the May 24th primary where the Secretary of State is on the ballot. Back to you.
Thank you, Blaine. That was NBC's Blaine Alexander reporting in Atlanta. 50 years ago, a psychiatrist made history with a risky revelation. Up next, we'll tell you how the man known as Dr. Anonymous changed mental health care in America. Plus, pediatricians are taking a big step towards caring for our children without racial bias. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Imagine giving a deeply personal speech to an audience of your peers while wearing a Richard Nixon mask. Not to be silly, but to be safe. It happened 50 years ago today at a conference of psychiatrists in Texas. Dr. John Fryer revolutionized mental health care by speaking publicly about being gay. But he did not look or sound like himself. He spoke as Dr. Henry Anonymous. His microphone disguised his voice, and yes, he did wear a Richard Nixon mask. His opening words, quote, "I am a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist," unquote. Dr. Fryer's speech lasted just over 10 minutes. He made a case for the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from a list of mental disorders. Here is the final minute of his remarks.
This is the greatest loss, our honest humanity. And that loss leads all those others around us to lose that little bit of their humanity as well. For if they were truly comfortable with their own homosexuality, then they could be comfortable with ours. As homosexual psychiatrists, therefore, we must use our skills and wisdom to help all of them and ourselves grow to be comfortable with that little piece of humanity called homosexuality.
Dr. Fryer was a professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. Today was Dr. John Fryer Day in the city and in the state of Pennsylvania. As for his speech, the APA delisted homosexuality as a mental illness less than a year later in 1973. Let's get deeper into this story with Jillian Eugenios, a contributor to the LGBTQ news site NBC Out. Jillian, this historical speech, I understand, was something that Dr. Fryer initially did not want to give. What persuaded him to take the risk?
Yeah, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. You know, Dr. Fryer, he knew the stakes. He did not want to do it at first. I mean, no one did. And that's what's really crucial, is that there was no win here. You know, it was not a time when people were out, especially psychiatrists. You know, thinking about it 50 years ago, there was not one out gay psychiatrist in America. It was too risky. They could lose everything. They could lose their job. And with Dr. Fryer specifically, he knew those stakes very well. He had lost a job. He had been thrown out of a residency because he was gay. He knew that it could cost him, and that's why he said no. However, you know, Barbara Giddings, who was one of the people who were put together, she was on the panel, and she had put the panel together with her partner, Kayla Husen, and they really wanted to hear from a gay psychiatrist, because on this panel there were two gay people, two psychiatrists, and when Dr. Fryer was approached by Barbara initially, he said no. And then months later, he thought some more, and he was like, you know what? Someone needs to say something. And, you know, to Barbara's credit, she was like, listen, I'll pay for you to go, because she got a grant. She was like, you can go in disguise. And he was like, okay, you know, if I can go in disguise, I can, you know, use a mic to change my voice. He wore a tuxedo 3 times his size and gave his speech. And he had to be masked. It was very brave.
Now, what we're talking about here is the classification in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Talk a little bit more about what the DSM is and why changing it was so pivotal.
Yeah, so the DSM is used by psychiatrists if it's a catalog of mental disorders, and if you were a homosexual at this time, it was thought that you were mentally ill because the DSM said you were. And that meant that you could be institutionalized against your will, you could lose a job, you could lose custody of a child. There were substantial risks. And by removing it from the DSM, that meant that you could no longer use psychiatry as a reason for your discrimination. And you could no longer hide behind that for excluding someone who was gay from something, or from, you know, not giving them a job or firing from a job or something. Although that's a kind of another story, because that did continue to happen. But yeah, it meant that as a class, if you were gay, you were seen as a whole, as an entirety of people, that you were ill.
Yeah. I wonder what some of the other efforts are to remember Dr. John Fryer and his efforts. I mean, I like to think of myself as a fairly astute student of history, especially LGBTQ history, since I am gay, and these are the kinds of things that I think I should know. I had never heard of this guy or his story until your piece. I didn't know this guy existed. There's a marker to him in the city of Philadelphia, because as we mentioned, he taught at Temple. But there is a larger push to try to make sure this story gets known and remembered.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. You know, a lot of people feel the way you do. That, I mean, some people feel that John Fryer's speech, it was on par with the importance of Stonewall, because of the way that it changed the way that LGBTQ people could be in this country. And I think that as we reflect on 50 years ago, we think about how important this was. And, today, for example, the mayor of Philadelphia is honoring him. As you mentioned at the top of this segment, it's John Fryer Day now. And, his papers are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And there's that plaque as well. So the history is there, but it's, up to us to continue to remember that, to work to uncover more about him and to remember his legacy. And I think that, when you think about how we live today as queer people, or even like the fact that you can go see a gay psychiatrist, and that there's a gay organization of psychiatrists, I mean, that is Fryer's legacy. And that's available to us is truly incredible and speaks to how important it was that he did that speech.
Philadelphia has a very remarkable LGBTQ history that doesn't always get quite as much of the attention that it deserves, especially compared to places like New York because of Stonewall. But this is just another example of why Philly's gay history is definitely worth knowing and highlighting. Jillian Eugenios, a contributor for NBC Out. I appreciate you telling the story, Jillian. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. It was a true pleasure.
Meanwhile, another medical group took steps today in leaving behind the prejudices of the past, specifically assumptions about children of different races. The American Academy of Pediatrics announced that it will examine its policies and guidelines to eliminate what is known as race-based medicine. The Academy says it's committed to, quote, dismantle the structural and systemic inequities that lead to racial health disparities, unquote. Last year, AAP retired an unproven guideline that said black children had a lower risk of urinary infections than white children. Other medical groups have taken similar pledges on race-based medicine. Back in 2020, the American Medical Association announced new policies to recognize race as a social construct, not a biological one. The Pediatricians Group is also encouraging other medical institutions and specialty groups to follow suit. We will get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including the results of the latest unionization drive at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, and the Supreme Court's decision on flying a Christian flag at Boston City Hall. The push to unionize Amazon warehouse workers in New York hit a roadblock today. Employees at a facility on Staten Island have voted against the effort. A vote at a different warehouse on Staten Island just succeeded. Amazon is trying to overturn that result. NBC's Antonia Hilton reports from the National Labor Relations Board offices in Brooklyn.
This afternoon, Amazon workers who work out at the LDJ5 warehouse in Staten Island lost a vote to unionize there. The ultimate result was 618 employees voting no and 380 voting yes, about a 61% turnout. And this has caused a lot of frustration and disappointment for many of the employees and organizers who've been on the ground here watching the tally roll in today in Brooklyn. They wanted to send a signal to Amazon. They wanted that first historic vote that happened at the JFK 8 facility just back in April to set a new precedent and to act like the first domino that would fall. And not just here in New York, but around the country. Over the last few weeks, employees have described an intense anti-union, union-busting effort at the LDJ5 facility. They say that Amazon managers pulled employees in for relentless one-on-one coercive meetings at which employees say they were pressured to vote no. Take a listen to Chris Smalls. He's a lead organizer and a former Amazon employee himself, describing some of what's happened over the last few weeks.
This is a call for action, really. You know, it is David versus Goliath, but it's not just myself, it's all of us. We all have to be David. Going up against Amazon, once again, one of the most powerful retailers in modern day history. So what we're witnessing, once again, is something that, you know, I think is going to change and shape the future of labor.
As for Amazon, they've made no secret of the fact that they were going to fight this unionization effort with everything that they had. They spent more than $4 million, according to financial filings, on an anti-union effort, on hiring consultants to help them with that work, and they released a statement celebrating today's result. When you talk to organizers on the ground, they say that they're going to be picking themselves up and getting back into the fight, because they say hundreds of other Amazon locations all around the country have contacted them with interest in organizing. So they say the union fight is going to continue. Back to you.
Thank you, Antonia. That's NBC's Antonia Hilton reporting from Brooklyn. Let's turn from e-commerce to e-currency. More people are spending Bitcoin for everyday purchases these days. Well, the cryptocurrency is also gaining a foothold in Cuba. That island is experiencing a crypto boom. U.S. sanctions are a big reason. Ed Augustin has the story.
It may look frozen in time, but Cuba is embracing the future. Its cryptocurrency market growing exponentially. An estimated 100,000 Cubans now use them, thanks largely to the rollout of mobile internet 3 years ago. Cafe owner Nelson Rodriguez now accepts payments in Bitcoin and Ethereum.
I like crypto because I believe in this philosophy.
So, as a first-timer, I'm hoping to pay for my meal.
Ethereum, send. Can I scan your QR code there?
Yeah, I got 11.99. It's fine.
So you're 1 cent short,
yeah.
And I got charged $5 more, but in the end, we managed to.
Yeah.
Perfect. Pleasure doing business with you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Most Cubans can't use internationally accepted credit or debit cards because of US sanctions. PayPal, Revolut, and Zelle are likewise banned. No problemo, says this plucky entrepreneur.
See you later, we don't need you anymore. That's the same behavior, that's the same way of thinking with all these services. Okay, you don't deliver services to me? Okay, no problem. I will use cryptocurrency to expand my business.
But with the embargo tighter than ever, international banks dealing with the island have been hit by steep fines. So even when the Cuban state has the money to buy food, vehicles and medicines, just making payments is a headache. Last week, the island issued new regulations for the use of cryptocurrencies. From now on, the central bank will issue licenses.
It is not at all a surprise that people in Cuba are looking at this, because if you could do transactions directly between two parties which don't have to go through a bank, they just through a separate channel, then that would be of interest.
Like most Cuban artists, Ernesto Cisneros saw his revenue slashed during the pandemic.
Con mi grupo yo hacía 100 conciertos al año. 100 conciertos cada año. Y de pronto, todo se detuvo. Es algo dramático.
But last year, he discovered non-fungible tokens, or NFTs. He now makes them, storing his music, videos, and photos on a blockchain and sells them online. The appeal of these new currencies and assets? Their decentralization and anonymity, tailor-made for busting sanctions.
You can't block to the Cubans the use of the cryptocurrencies. That's a fact.
But it's still unclear how US sanctions could apply to Cuba's cryptocurrency market.
If you're trying to do a crypto transaction which gets around sanctions, then it's the same process as getting around anti-money laundering legislation. So trying to do one without doing the other seems to me to be a kind of a critical issue in terms of working out how to do it.
That was Ed Augustin reporting. Today at the Supreme Court, a First Amendment case ended with a unanimous decision. It had to do with a flagpole outside Boston City Hall. The city had prevented a religious group from flying a Christian flag there, but the justices ruled that move was unconstitutional. NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams explains why.
This case had religious overtones. It involved a Christian group wanting to fly a flag with a cross on it, but the decision is fundamentally about free speech rights, not freedom of religion. The Supreme Court said the city of Boston created a public forum open to all comers when it allowed organizations to use a flagpole in front of City Hall for commemorative events. This ruling says denying the same treatment for the Christian group after saying yes to everybody else amounted to viewpoint discrimination and a violation of free expression. So this ruling was a victory for a group called Camp Constitution, which says part of its mission is enhancing understanding of America's Judeo-Christian heritage. The group wanted to raise a flag bearing a Latin cross during a one-hour event that would have included speeches about Boston's history from local clergy. that the City Hall in Boston has 3 flagpoles in front. 2 of them are for the flags of the U.S. and Massachusetts, and the city makes the 3rd one available to private organizations that have these commemorations on the plaza in front of the building to commemorate the community's diversity. Camp Constitution sued after the Boston City Hall turned down its request by saying that flying the Christian flag would amount to an unconstitutional government endorsement of religion. Today's decision, written by Justice Stephen Breyer, says no, the city could not censor a religious message in what amounted to a public forum. The court said allowing the Christian flag to fly would not be an unconstitutional government endorsement of religion because it would merely treat religious and non-religious views the same. In a brief concurrence, Justice Brett Kavanaugh said that's the essence of what the court said today, that the government can't treat religious persons, religious organizations, or religious speech as second class. The city of Boston actually suspended this flag program while the case was in the court, and now says it will ensure that future city programs abide by the decision. Joshua?
Thank you, Pete. That's NBC's Justice correspondent Pete Williams. A-list celebrities and unusual outfits. Just another night in Manhattan. We hit the red carpet at tonight's Met Gala. Before we go, it's a big night in New York fashion. The Met Gala is back. It's happening now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, not far from here. Tonight's theme is In America, an Anthology of Fashion. That builds on last year's theme, a lexicon of fashion. The dress code is gilded glamour, white tie. The Met Gala has been around since 1948. It was the brainchild of Eleanor Lambert, one of America's most influential fashion publicists. Ms. Lambert was the founder of New York Fashion Week. The Met Gala, as we know it, began in 1995 when Vogue editor Anna Wintour took over. She turned it into the cultural phenomenon it is today. Now it's a moment for the world's rich and famous to push boundaries in couture. Billy Porter among them, very much so. Joining us now is Brian Balthazar, an entertainment journalist and pop culture expert. Mr. Balthazar, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Can I ask a question just for the non-fabulous among us, like the Met Gala? Why? Fancy people in outrageous outfits, very cute for them, but why should anybody else beyond the 4 corners of the Met care what's going on there right now?
Well, I think it's a good lesson in how spectacle creates publicity. You know, this is at its core a fundraiser. This is for the Met's Costume Institute, which incidentally, this is its only source of funding for their budgetary year. It is not included in the museum's actual financial picture. So they have to get their money for all their curators, all their salaries, all their staffers from this event. So yeah, okay, it's easy to kind of roll your eyes at the spectacle that we have here, but it's because of the eye-catching nature. We don't see anything like this at the Oscars anymore, maybe a little bit at the Grammys, but this is about expression. I think it's also easy to overlook the importance in fashion in history and how it has changed and how it is a reflection of our economy, how it is a reflection of our history. And when we think back to decades past, when we think of when we graduated from high school or when we graduated from college, we remember the kind of clothes we wore. And I think it's really easy to downplay that, but it's very, very significant, actually.
I think it's also kind of a moment for people to make an impression and make a statement. I mean, we just saw Janelle Monáe there near the end. There was Ryan Reynolds in a white tie. But that first shot we saw, I don't know if we can go back to the video we just played. The first person we saw was Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, who was wearing a suit that said "End Gun Violence" on the back. There he is. So there's Eric Adams, right, the First Lady of New York. And you'll see on the back he's wearing a suit that says "End Gun Violence." I understand that this is kind of a fashion event, but it's also kind of a chance for people to make statements and stand out even beyond the fashion.
Exactly. And you demonstrate the point perfectly. In order to get attention nowadays, to make that statement, he could have easily gone to this event in a black tie, tuxedo and been perfectly welcomed. But the reason we're talking about it is because he did something bold. And certainly celebrities are masters at getting attention. I mean, it's kind of how they got where they are. But it's people like him and others that decide to use this platform that we're spending our time on right now, that thousands and thousands of people are watching, to make a statement. And there's tremendous power in that. And so I think it's how people, celebrities and politicians and whoever does attend, it's $35,000 a ticket if you're invited, and someone usually covers that for you, hopefully, if you're lucky, a brand in some cases. But it's an opportunity. How are you going to use this platform? When we fill that screen, what is it you're going to fill that screen with? And I applaud someone like that who's making a statement for good.
With regard to filling the screen, we also now have video of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton entering at the Met Gala. Her dress apparently had the names of women that she said inspired her. That was part of her look for the red carpet at the Met Gala this year. What's it been like coming back to the Met Gala now after 2 years away? COVID kind of upset everybody's plans. How has that gone?
Right. Well, you know, we had a kind of like a abbreviated version of this just in September. It's usually in May, as you said. Now they have 400 attendees. Usually it's 500 to 600. The theme being gilded glamour. And this is an exact example of you can do that gilded glamour thing, as so many people did very well. Blake Lively among them. There's Anna Wintour right there.
There's Anna Wintour, yeah.
Ringleader herself. But, you know, I think this is a matter, and you see the people in the background, many of them wearing masks. This is a world where people have to make a conscious decision. Are they going to incorporate masks into what they wear out? And they don't. So it's a reflection of where we are as a society when you really think about it. You see some people with them, some people without them. We're living in a different time, but the show must go on for many people. And here's an example of that. There's Blake Lively, who is one of the co-hosts of the event with her husband, Ryan Reynolds. Her dress actually transforms, and those beads were evocative of New York City architecture, and then she turns into the Statue of Liberty. So many people, many of the celebrities tonight, not only talking gilded, but they're also honoring the city of New York and a comeback. They're making a statement about New York is back and trying to bring it back too, because we're all really trying to resuscitate the energy and excitement about this city and this country as we know it. And we've all struggled to do that for the past 2 years.
There's also been a number of deaths in the fashion world. Virgil Abloh, Terry Mugler, Andre Leon Talley that have died very recently. How does their absence affect the gala this year?
Well, and most notably Andre Leon Talley, who was just memorialized just days ago. You know, it's hard to measure the impact that those people have because we're really just getting back out. We're kind of peeking our heads out of the door for the first time. But his impact in particular, incredible. We saw Naomi Campbell speak about him just days ago in the most glorious getup that we know that he would love. And he went to the Met Gala fearlessly and boldly, and that's the spirit of what this event is. It's about expressing yourself fearlessly. There we have Rihanna in an iconic gown. I wish I could remember that. There's Billy Porter. This is about making a statement. Now, sometimes it's only like a subtle nod to the theme, but we kind of embrace it. Lady Gaga, of course. I think that's 2019, where she spent 16 minutes presenting herself. And then you have Madonna in that beautiful plaid outfit. And, you know, also, we'll see some memes tomorrow. This is about buzz. Not everything will be well received, or somebody's going to see a punchline in one of these moments, and you're going to see that explode on Twitter. But, you know, like I said, you know, this is also kicking off the anthology of American fashion. And in that exhibit, there is a coat worn by George Washington. There's a coat worn by Abraham Lincoln when he was assassinated. And there's a coat worn or clothing worn by an enslaved person to show that what we wear says a lot about what we're going through at that given moment. And while this event certainly is spectacular and over the top, it's important to remember that what we wear is really indicative of what we're going through at a given moment in time. And I think it's important to remember that.
Well, and before I have to let you go, I'm glad you brought that up, because we should remember the Metropolitan Museum of Art is still a museum, first and foremost. Yeah. It is one of the most incredible museums I've ever been to. I'm happy to be a member of the Met. And this is kind of one of those moments where we look at something like fashion, which can often feel very frivolous, as a reflection of who we are, as a kind of a cultural marker before we go.
Absolutely. I mean, very down to the fabrics that we're wearing. Are we wearing things that are durable? Are we wearing things that are luxurious? You know, it says a lot about we are as a people, as an economy, and where we stand. And you know, even the employees of Condé Nast, who recently unionized as recently as March, are saying that behind the cameras, there are hundreds of Vogue workers who are underpaid, undervalued, and overworked. So this is a dialogue that is happening in front of the cameras and behind the scenes. It's very much what's happening in the moment, and we're living it right now as we speak.
Yeah, and everyone definitely has an opinion on fashion. I still get angry comments from people who say I should be wearing a tie, but here we are. Brian Balthazar,
you're a rebel.
Appreciate you making
time.
A rebel. Thank you, sir. That's right. Thank you. I'm glad somebody understands. Thank you, Brian. We appreciate it. And thank you for making time for us. Remember to take Now Tonight with you on the go as a podcast. If you do that, you never have to look at the fact that I'm not wearing a tie. To subscribe, scan that QR code on the screen. You'll get each night's episode. You can also listen on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Remember to follow us on social media for the latest on upcoming topics and guests. We're at NBC Now Tonight. You can always reach us with a brief but brilliant voicemail or leave us an email. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.